There's been a lot of talk about this group called the NIFB lately, the New Independent Fundamentalist Baptist Movement. I did a video on them recently. It's led by Steven Anderson, and their claim to fame is some really intensely hateful beliefs. Steven Anderson has a YouTube channel with 120,000 subscribers. That's almost as big as my channel. I'm coming into this assuming that you guys don't know much about what he has to say, but trust me when I say it's disturbing. The NIFB is a fairly recent branch off from the IFB, or the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist Movement, which is the group that Genetically Modified Skeptic came from, interestingly enough. And they have a bunch of different churches that fall under the umbrella. As a result, you'll find lots of YouTube channels connected to lots of different churches and members under the NIFB umbrella. And those YouTube channels will release the most vile, disgusting, hateful, horrific stuff. Most of the channels are really small, so the odd video will pop up here or there from a YouTube channel with 50 or 60 followers, and as soon as the stuff gets posted, it gets flagged as hate speech by YouTube, and the channel gets deleted. But before the videos are deleted, people save a copy. The Atheist Rationale, Atheist T-Girl, and others have been watching this back and forth for a while, and saved a massive repository of videos that keep getting uploaded and taken down. Well, the other night, I perused the videos, gave them a listen, and what I found was scary, to say the least. Unfortunately, I can't tell you guys what they say because it will actually get my channel deleted. It isn't about monetization at this point. I just don't want to see my channel go the same way as the channels that upload the content in the first place. But one of these days, I'll upload a full expose to another platform so it's on record. Because at this moment, if you Google the NIFB, their most hateful and disgusting stuff is lost to time. You'll find some bad stuff, but not anywhere near the worst of it. Maybe I'll do a full video exposing all of it and put it on my website or something. Anyways, I can at least go through and do a bite model analysis on the group. So let's take a look at the NIFB and determine if it's a cult or not. Let's get into it. One quick thing before we continue. I'm having a meetup in Lincoln, Nebraska on June 30th from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. If you guys want to come hang out and grill with me at a park, then check the card in the corner or the link in the description. I'm selling tickets, but it's just supposed to cover the cost of the food and stuff. So come meet up with me and we'll hang out for the evening. Also, if you like the work I do and you want to see me continue to do it, consider supporting me on Patreon and or Teespring. I would like to get to the point where I don't rely on ads from YouTube because YouTube is completely unreliable. The past month has been rough for views, and it makes me nervous that they might just come along and demonetize my entire channel one of these days. You can reach both Patreon and Teespring through the card in the corner or the link in the description too. Okay, moving on. I know I explain what the bite model is every time I go through one of these, but I want to make sure we're on the same page because the last time I did one, I think I was around 100,000 subscribers. The bite model was written by Steven Hassan, a cult expert. He's written a few books on how they operate and how they attract and keep members. He wrote the bite model, which is an acronym that stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotion control. The bite model points out common themes you find running through all cults. So I came up with a scoring system. It's basically 1 to 7, except I used the Fibonacci sequence instead of 1 to 7 because it shows an exponential growth in extremism the worse cults get. I'll put the scores at the bottom of the screen so you guys can get a feel for how it works. One more thing I wanted to say before we get started. I want to give a shout out to the YouTuber The Atheist Rationale because he compiled a list of clips and information that was instrumental in helping me do this breakdown. So thanks to The Atheist Rationale. With that being said, let's go through the bite model breakdown of the NIFB movement. The first category on the bite model is behavior control. Here's the first point. 1. Promote dependence and obedience. The NIFB does this to a pretty heavy extent, though I've seen worse. I'd call this one an 8 because they aren't allowed to question what the pastor says. You're either in or out. You agree or you're excommunicated. But we'll get to excommunication in a little bit. 2. Modify behavior with rewards and punishments. A good example of behavior modification through a system of rewards and punishments would be showering you with praise and attention if you follow their strict set of rules and obey the hierarchy, or withdrawing the love and attention, or even shunning you if you break the rules. It can get even more intricate than that, but we'll explore it as we go on. In the case of the NIFB movement, I'd give them a score of 13 because they do this, but I've seen worse examples. I'd say they're about on par with Jehovah's Witnesses. 3. Dictate where and with whom you live. This is less of a problem with the NIFB, but there are some issues. For example, you can't be close to somebody who they deemed to be a sinner, or somebody they've excommunicated. So I'm giving them a 5 because I can definitely think of worse examples. Number 4, restrict or control sexuality. They heavily restrict or control sexuality. In fact, that's one of their worst qualities. They hate people from the GRSM community. And hate is their word, not mine. They believe that hate is righteous and sanctioned by God. They also think that you're supposed to judge people, and anybody who says otherwise is taking the Bible out of context. They're a lot like the Westboro Baptist Church in that respect, except they're a lot bigger. The Westboro Baptist Church has like 40 members now, I think. The NIFB is multinational and has 30 churches, with between 50 and 300 members per church. Anyways, I'd put them at a 13 for this one. In addition to all of that, they also famously believe that a wife is expected to sleep with her husband whenever he wants, whether she wants to or not. It isn't about her wants. You consented when you said I do. According to Steven Anderson, the leader of the NIFB movement, the only consent given in a marriage should be consent to not do something. Like, is it okay if we don't do anything tonight? No? That's not okay? Alright, let's go then. Number 5. Control clothing and hairstyle. They do this, but really not much more than any other Christian religion. So I'd put them at a 3. I'd rather undershoot than overshoot when I do these breakdowns, because if something is a cult, it'll show, even if I'm generous with my assessments. So I'll go with 3. Number 6, regulate what and how much you eat and drink. They don't really do this at all. There are some instances of Steven Anderson yelling at his congregation about not eating junk food, and how you should be spending your money on carrots instead of McDonald's. That kind of rhetoric. And the yelling is kind of a problem, but the dietary restrictions aren't really. Oh, except he has a problem with veganism. He calls it its own religion. It's kind of strange. So, anyways, I'm putting them at a high 2. Number 7, deprive you of 7 to 9 hours of sleep. They don't do this much either, unless you count overloading you with work, like sending you out to knock on doors or study literature nonstop, which I do count, so I'm putting them firmly at a baseline 2. Could be worse. Number 8, exploit you financially. They're serious about tithing. They make a big deal of it. You have to give a percentage. In that way, it's pretty similar to Mormonism. I'd put them at a 13 because I can think of worse examples. Jim Jones was a communist and as such believed that wealth should all go to the same pool and spread out equally. I think that would be the worst case. Number 9. Restrict leisure time and activities. I would rate this one as reasonably high because there are a lot of restrictions on what you're allowed to and not allowed to do. Lots of movies you can't see, lots of activities you can't do, because they don't bring glory to God. Not to mention the fact that you're expected to knock on doors and go to meetings a lot, just like Jehovah's Witnesses. They call their door knocking experience soul winning, where Jehovah's Witnesses call it going in service. It's basically going from door to door trying to get people saved. The interesting difference here is that they seem to believe that once you're saved for life. So they'll do a little prayer at the door with somebody to get them saved and move on to the next one. Anyways, I got a little off track with this one. I'd put them at about an 8. Number 10, require you to seek permission for major decisions. They aren't as bad with this one either. A lot of their worst stuff comes in through thought control more than anything. But I'd still put them at about a 5 with this one because they do still want to control your life in a totalitarian type of way, just not as intensely as other groups. Okay, that's all the points for behavior control. Let's take a look at information control. Number 1, deliberately withhold and distort information. Steve Anderson is famously a huge conspiracy theorist. He talks about every conspiracy you could imagine, and he says that the New World Order or the Illuminati is pushing their pro-Jewish and pro-gay agendas through the mainstream media. Oh yeah, he's also pretty anti-Semitic. He says he isn't, but he definitely is. He denies that the story of World War II is fully truthful, if that makes sense. He did a whole documentary called Marching to Zion. This is another one of those subjects on which I've heard him speak that I pretty much can't repeat. I can't even play a video of what he said because if I did, my YouTube channel would straight up get shut down for hate speech. And unfortunately, the videos are removed from YouTube because they're too hateful, genuinely. So you probably aren't going to stumble across this naturally if you go Google the NIFB. I'm going to go with a 5 for deliberately withholding and distorting information because I've definitely seen worse. 2. Forbid you from speaking with ex-members and critics. They're pretty serious about this one, but it's more avoiding ex-members than it is avoiding critics. Though you aren't really supposed to associate with either. They're reprobates, they're evil, Satan got his hands on them, that kind of rhetoric. So I'm putting them at a 13 on this one, where I think I'd say Jehovah's Witnesses are about a 21. Number 3. Discourage access to non-cult sources of information. As I mentioned earlier, Steve Anderson is pretty heavily into conspiracy theories, and as a result, believes that everybody is lying to him. He thinks we should avoid a lot of different media outlets. But I've seen worse, so I'm going with an 8 on this. As I've said, I'd rather undershoot than overshoot. Number 4. divide information into insider versus outsider doctrine. This is probably one of their worst qualities. They do this intentionally and openly, and if you disagree with them, then you're the enemy. But that's contributing to an us versus them mentality, and I'll get to that in a bit. I'm gonna say 21 for this. Number 5. Generate and use propaganda extensively. They do this very extensively in the form of videos. As I mentioned, Steve Anderson, the leader, has a YouTube channel with about 120,000 subscribers. Now, I don't know that I'd call his long-form sermons propaganda exactly, but he uses his audience to push propagandistic documentaries and other forms of video. His members, like Matt Powell and others, release emotionally charged videos all the time. I'm gonna say 21. I put Jehovah's Witnesses down as a 21 too, because the Watchtower Society is actually a printing company, and that's all they do. It's a propaganda factory. But being in video and documentary form doesn't make it any less propagandistic. In fact, in some cases, it can be more propagandistic, because it's easier to grab somebody by the heart and manipulate them when you combine audio and visual cues, like sad music and people crying. Number 6. Use information gained in confession sessions against you. They do this pretty heavily. In fact, there's an example of Steve Anderson getting up on his lectern yelling at people to get out of his church because they told a friend in the church that they didn't know how they felt about this or that doctrine. He publicly shames them in the most abrasive and aggressive way he can. So I'm putting down 21. Number 7. Gaslight to make you doubt your own memory. I haven't seen systematic gaslighting, which is usually what I look for, but some of the members do this. I would give this a low score. I'll say 3. Number 8. Require you to report thoughts, feelings, and activities to superiors. They're pretty serious about this one in some ways too, but I would give them a reasonably low number because they aren't as serious as some other groups. So I'll go with 5, because they're still required to report some things. But Heaven's Gate would probably be my most intense example of this, where they'd sit around a table in the morning and report their sexual feelings to everybody else, as a way of publicly shaming themselves. Number 9. Encourage you to spy and report on others' misconduct, quote unquote. I'd put him at a solid 5 here. The reason I say this is a problem in this group is because of the examples of Steve Anderson screaming at people from his lectern, telling them to leave the church because some member told him about some way in which somebody disagreed with his doctrine or something. Next, we've got thought control. Here's the first point. Instill black and white, us versus them, good versus evil thinking. This one is very clearly a 21. This is as intense as it gets. If you're a brother, then you're with us. If you aren't, then you're a reprobate. You're evil. God gave you over to the world. They have an intense hatred for critics or ex-members. And here's the catch. They arbitrarily determine who's in the out-group. That's really the problem with in-grouping and out-grouping. I'm against homophobia, transphobia, or discrimination of any kind. One might say it's good to have an us versus them mentality about people who engage in discriminatory behavior. But the problem is that when you start placing people into in-groups and out-groups, you're casting a wide net and the wrong people get caught in it. I don't hate Christians. I don't hate homophobes. I hate Christianity and homophobia. There's a very important distinction to be made there. We shouldn't be placing people into out-groups. We should let them place themselves into the group. I'm not going to criticize somebody for being homophobic. I'm going to criticize their homophobic position. It seems like a small distinction, but it's seriously so important. So I'm putting them down at 21 for this. They're also very anti-public school. They think public schools are pushing a gay agenda too, just like the media, and lots of other agendas. It's part of a persecution complex. This next point is one I added to the BITE model myself. It doesn't really exist as part of the official model, but I call it placing overreaching or exaggerated importance on events or ideas. Here's a good example. They have a serious problem with homosexuality. Ultimately, who really cares? Is it that important what two people in the privacy of their own home do? Who cares, and why is it any of our business? Is it worth advocating for the death penalty for these people over it? Is it really that important? Here's another example of it. Steve Anderson told a story recently about how he was driving by a billboard and he saw a woman in a bikini on it, out of the corner of his eye. He said he kept his eyes on the road because he didn't want to lust after her in his heart. It's just a picture on a billboard. Is it really that big of a deal? Is it really that important that you would avert your eyes? And what are the consequences if you do look? Are you going to hell over that? Placing overreaching or exaggerated importance on an event or idea, with extreme consequences for insignificant things. I'd say they're a solid 13 on this one, because surprisingly, I can think of more extreme examples, but they're definitely up there. Number 3. change your identity, possibly even your name. They don't do this to a heavy extent. I'd say calling each other brother this or sister that could be considered changing your identity or even your name, but it isn't really strong in this church, so I'm going with 2. Number 4. Use loaded language and cliches to stop complex thought. They use loaded language and cliches constantly. It's a real problem. Though I can't really repeat some of the loaded language they use because it's another one of those things that will get my channel deleted. I was between a 13 and a 21 for this, but I'm prone to be generous, so I'll go 13. Number 5. Induce hypnotic or trance states to indoctrinate. I wouldn't say they're terribly bad about this one. I'd call Pentecostals the worst about this, and put them at 21. But it isn't really this group's thing, so I'm going with 2 because they still pray and sing and whatnot. Number 6. Teach thought-stopping techniques to prevent critical thoughts. I haven't seen too many examples of this, but I suspect that it happens. It's hard to tell without watching every sermon from every pastor involved. I'm putting them at a 3 because I haven't seen too many specific examples. That might change at some point if I do see them though. Number 7. Allow only positive thoughts. This one is definitely not a hallmark of the cult. They're pretty serious about hate. It's kind of their flagship belief. They think that hate is righteous because God hated some people in the Bible, so we should too. Though they're pretty serious about positivity and fellowship toward other members of the cult, so I'm gonna say 3. Number 8. Use excessive meditation, singing, prayer, and chanting to block thoughts. This is another one where they aren't really bad about it. They do sing and pray at church, but I don't know of any examples of them using mantras or meditation to block thoughts, so I'm going with 2. Number 9. Reject rational analysis, critical thinking, and doubt. They can be bad about this one. As I mentioned earlier, Steven Anderson believes that public school pushes conspiracies and agendas on kids. It's hard to illustrate without showing some of their clips, but they definitely do this. I'd place them at an 8. And finally, we've got emotional control. Number 1. Instill irrational fears or phobias of questioning or leaving the group. They aren't terrible about this one because they think that if you're saved once, you're saved forever, though they do instill a fear of hell more intensely than most churches. And as far as I know, if you're excommunicated, then you go to hell. So I'll put them at 8 because I can think of examples of churches that instill more phobias of leaving. Number 2. Label some emotions as evil, worldly, sinful, or wrong. There are some examples of Steve Anderson listing off unnatural thoughts and feelings, particularly in regards to love for certain people or hate for others. So I'd put this pretty high. I'd say 8. Because I can think of more intense examples. Number 3. Teach emotion-stopping techniques to prevent anger or homesickness. I haven't seen too many examples of this one, so I'm putting them at a 1. Number 4. Promote feelings of guilt, shame, and unworthiness. They're really bad about this one. I'd say they land on a solid 13 here. Any thoughts that are out of line are evil, and you should be shamed for it. Not to mention the fact that Steve Anderson has a tendency to shame people publicly, as I mentioned earlier. Number 5. Shower you with praise and attention. Love bombing. This does happen. They're friendly to newcomers. Their religion really boils down to hate. Who should you hate? And they try to twist that intensity dial until it breaks. So I'm giving them a lower number for this. I'll go with 2. Number 6. Threaten your friends and family. This one isn't as intense as some either. I'll go with 2 because they do threaten people. It's just not necessarily in this context. Number 7. Shun if you disobey or disbelieve. They do practice excommunication, and you're supposed to avoid certain types of people, like ex-members and critics. I've heard Steve Anderson talk about this specifically, though I don't think it's as intense as, say, Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm giving them a lower score, maybe an 8. And finally, the very last point on the bite model. Number 8. Teach that there's no happiness or peace outside the group. They're very serious about this. I'm giving them a 21. They think the world is miserable, completely separated from God. A lot like Jehovah's Witnesses in that respect. And mixing conspiracy theories in with beliefs doesn't help. I was hoping to find an opportunity to bring this up at some point, but I didn't really find one. Steven Anderson is famously anti-vax. He also believes that apricot seeds cure cancer. He believes that he has all of the answers, and the world is completely lost because of the information the New World Order is pushing down everybody's throats. He's a genuinely harmful person, with genuinely violent ideas, and he genuinely needs to have his platform taken away because of it. I don't mean because of his anti-vaccine stuff, or other conspiracies he spreads. I mean because he advocates for the deaths of minorities. That is one step too far for me. He can talk about that until he's blue in the face, but in my eyes, he shouldn't be allowed to do it to a crowd of people. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. As I've said before, if you like what I do and you want to see me continue to do it, consider supporting me on Patreon. I want to get to the point where I could reasonably go ad-free. I don't want to have to worry about whether or not I'll be able to pay rent if I put out a video that's demonic monetized. I want to be able to talk about what I feel needs to be said. You can support me on Teespring too if you want to take a look at my shirts and stickers and stuff there. Also check me out on Facebook, and don't forget about my podcast where I talk about all kinds of interesting stuff. I cover lots of news articles on there and how I feel about them. So take a look. All links are in the description as always. Okay? Thanks for watching, guys.